Before I knew what domino reduction was, I saw it as some magical FMC method to get insanely efficient solutions. I had no clue what it was or how it worked. But a few weeks ago, I decided that I wanted to learn what DR is and how to use it. At first it seemed pretty simple, but it led me down an FMC rabbit hole that got complicated pretty quickly. This video is going to follow my process of learning DR, and at the end of it I'll reconstruct a 25 DR single. Keep in mind that this isn't a tutorial and it's more of an overview of what DR is. So first off, what exactly is domino reduction? DR is when you have EO solved on two axes and you have CO solved as well. That means that all of the E layer edges have to be in the E layer so that when you do a Y rotation, those edges don't change their good orientation. So this cube is an example of DR on the UD axis. Here we have corner orientation solved with only white and yellow on U and D. And we have edge orientation from both this LR axis and this FB axis. So once the cube is in DR, then you can solve the rest of the cube using the moveset U, D, F2, B2, R2, and L2. So you'll never be doing quarter turns on the side. And that makes sense because this is basically EO on two axes. But how exactly do you get to DR? The first step is edge orientation, which you can do on any axis. It shouldn't take any more than 5 moves. On the scramble, I know that doing this will solve edge orientation on the UD axis with red top and white front, or blue top and white front. It's the same thing. The next step is setting up a domino reduction trigger. There are 4 main DR triggers and they're named by how many pieces away the cube is from DR. The most common trigger is 4C, 4E, and it makes up like 80% of DRs, and it looks like this. So here we have 4 misoriented corners, which is why we have 4C, and these 4 edges are bad because they are where they're not supposed to be. These 2 edges need to be in the E slice, and these 2 edges need to be in the UD layers. So to solve it, we just set up these 2 columns like this, like that, here and here, over the 2 bad edges in the E layer, and then we do an R or an R prime, and that solves DR. The other 3 triggers are F2L solutions. We have like this, where we have these 3 corners that are misoriented, and we have 1 bad edge in the E layer and 1 bad edge in the U layer. So this is called 3C2E for 3 corners and 2 edges, and it's solved like that. You can think of it as inserting this F2L pair into F2L. We also have the trigger like this, where we have the split F2L pair, or at least you can think of it like that, and we have 2 bad edges again, and 3 misoriented corners. So we solve it like this. The last DR trigger is 4C2E, where we have these 2 bad edges, and then we have these 4 misoriented corners, and we solve it like that, which is, again, F2L. To set up these triggers, you first need the correct number of misoriented corners and misplaced edges. Ideally, you should do 0 to 2 moves after EO, depending on how long your EO is. Going back to this cube as an example, we have edge orientation on the UD axis. I can rotate either way, it doesn't really matter. I'll be rotating here, and then I can do F prime and then R. So what that does is it sets up these 2 edges, which are now good, and these 2 are bad. So we have 4E, because we not only have these 2 edges, but also this one needs to be in the E layer, and it's not, and this one needs to be in the E layer, and it's not. So we have 4 edges, and I also oriented 4 corners, here, 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 and here. So from here we have 4E, 4C. Now that I have the correct number of misoriented corners and misplaced edges, I need to set up to the trigger. So the way I do that on the scramble is like this. I do a BR2. So that has this semicolon here, and this semicolon here, and this column here. And then I'll do a B2 that solves this column, and then brings this one to the top. And then I do B R prime, and that solves DR. Visualizing where the misoriented corners and stuff are can be really tricky because you're not really used to thinking about opposite colors as basically being the same, but DR forces you to think like that. So here we have like a column, which can be kind of hard to see, but you'll get used to it. So finally, we've reduced the cube to a domino. Usually, you'll have to check a lot of different EOs to find an efficient DR, and some top FMCers check over 50 EOs on a scramble. Personally, I'm not that good at finding EOs and checking them quickly, so I'll check around 20 and hope one of them has a good DR. But getting the cube to a DR state is only half the solve. The second half is the DR finish, and there are several ways to finish the cube. The most straightforward way is just block building as much as possible and solving the rest through commutators. My current PB single used this method to go from an 8-move DR to a 19-move 2E2E, then I inserted a 6-move 2E2E alg, cancelling one move to get a 24. Another approach is to solve corners, solving as many edges as possible along the way, then doing edge insertions to solve the rest. So this is going to be really inefficient, but that might look like this. And now I'm left with just a bunch of edges. Edge insertions in domino reduction are way better than in regular solves because you have EO on 2 axes and you're likely to cancel moves. So even inserting multiple edge insertions into a corner first skeleton is a viable option. Another option is to block build and create pairs until you can find a direct finish, but this isn't a reliable option. Finally, the most complicated approach and the current meta for world-class solvers is HTR. Just like how DR is EO on 2 axes and CO, HTR is DR on 2 axes with CO on all 3 axes. In other words, you can solve the rest of the cube using only half turns, and it will look like this where you have only the same and opposite colors on every face. HTR is the best method of finding an optimal solution after DR, but it's difficult to get to because you can't just pick another axis and do domino reduction again. You have to do something called DR corners. Essentially, you use the corners to determine how many quarter turns away from HTR the cube is after DR, reduce the quarter turn count to 1 or 2, then set up an HTR trigger that has the correct number of quarter turns, then use the trigger to solve HTR. It's pretty complicated, so I'm not going to go any further than that, but I'll have a lot of resources in the description if you're interested in learning more, and the example solve at the end of this video does use HTR, so I'll go a bit more in detail there. Anyways, once you're in HTR, finishing the cube is much easier. Sometimes you'll be able to find a direct finish, like this. But if not, it's usually optimal to solve the 2 layers of your original DR axis while leaving either a 3E or a 2E2E in the E slice. Because of the way DR and HTR work, a lot of the time you'll be able to modify your solution to solve the rest of the E layer in just 0 to 2 moves, which is pretty crazy. But if you can't find a direct finish and you can't solve 2 opposite layers, then you can just block build as much as you can and again use insertions to solve the rest. Learning all of this stuff was difficult for me. DR changes how you see a cube, and trying to set pieces up to a DR trigger can be really challenging. It kind of reminds me of when I saw block building on Megaminx for the first time. People can block build solutions that you'd never see on your own. I've gotten pretty okay at getting the cube into a DR state with unlimited time, but I still have a lot of work to do at checking EOs faster, doing DRs faster, and then doing HTR finishes. So the rest of this video is going to be a reconstruction of a 25 that I got using DR and HTR. If you don't want to watch that, then thanks for watching this video, I guess. Yeah, if you do want to watch that, then let's just start now. The scramble's going to be on the screen if you want to follow along. I actually started on the inverse, so I'm going to do the inverse scramble. Okay, so I checked a bunch of different EOs and I decided to do a 4-move EO on the FB axis. So first I've got to find the bad edges. I have one here, 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 and here, and here. And here, back here. So I have 6 bad edges, like this. Generally, when you have 6 bad edges, you want to put 3 of them on one face, like this, then do an F to change the EO, or an F prime. So now these 3 edges are good, and this one is bad, and now you're left with 4 bad edges. So that's exactly what I did on the scramble. I set up these 3 bad edges to the front, F, so now these 3 are good, and this one is bad. I do a U2, so it's on the back. Now all 4 bad edges are on the back, and I'll do a B to finish EO. The next thing I want to do is set up to a DR trigger. So I have two options. I can either set it up on the UD axis or rotate and solve it on the LR axis because I have edge orientation on both. I couldn't find anything on the UD axis, so I solved it on orange-red. So right now I have the correct number of oriented corners and misoriented corners, but I have 4 bad edges in the E-slice. You can tell because they have red and orange on them, and those belong in the top. I want 2 edges that are supposed to be in this layer to go into that layer so I can set up a 4C, 4E trigger. The way that I do that is with an L, then a U. So that put that and that edge into the E layer without changing corner orientation. So now I have these 2 good edges, and I still have 4 misoriented corners. So now that I have the correct number of bad edges and corners, I have to set up the DR trigger. I have a corner piece here, here, and here. This one is actually making a semicolon, and we have this and that make a semicolon as well. So the way I solve this is with an F2 to complete this column. And right now I could do a D2, so I'll have this column down here, and I'll have this column up here. But if I do that D2, then both of these bad edges in the E-slice are in front, and that's not how the trigger works. So before I do that, I'll first do L prime R, and then I'll do an F2 instead of a D2. So now I have this column in the top and this column in the bottom, but the edges, the bad edges in the E-slice are set up correctly. And after I do that, then I can just finish by putting both of these columns on this layer and turning, and now I'm in DR. So now I'm gonna switch back to the normal scramble. Okay, so after I've solved domino reduction, I now recognize the corner case, so I know how many quarter turns away from HTR I am. So there's an entire system on recognition, and there's a bunch of algorithms, but I'm just going to gloss over that. This is 3 quarter turns away from HTR. The first quarter turn is an AUF, so I'll just do L prime, and now I am 2 quarter turns away from HTR. And there are some 2 quarter turn HTR triggers, so I'll just look to see if I have any of those. I'll hold my original DR on left and right, so I can actually do DR on another axis. And let's look at the green-blue DR. Right now, I have 4 misoriented corners here, and I have 2 bad edges, this one back here, and this one on top. So this is perfectly set up for a 4C 2E case, which looks like this. Basically, I want to set up this column here and this vertical bar so I can solve it like that. So going back to this cube, I have this column on top here already, but I don't have the vertical bar, so I'll just do that. And now I have the vertical bar here and the column over here, and that's set up for the HTR trigger. However, once I actually do this trigger, I'm not an HTR. This is called fake HTR, which is where you have the same and opposite colors on every side, but you're not an HTR because you can't solve this using only half turns. So fake HTR is definitely a really weird concept, but it's one that you can get around pretty easily. Before inserting this trigger here, I can instead do a B2, then L2, but instead of L2, I want to preserve this block, so I'll do wide L2. It doesn't really matter what you're doing with the slice here. And then U2, which I guess F2, U2, this face. And now I've basically set up the trigger on the opposite side where I have the vertical bar here and the column over here. And now I can insert this normally, and this is real HTR. Now, this doesn't look very close to solved yet, but I noticed that if I rotate back to this axis, we have this block here, and I can utilize that to misalign these. I'm breaking HDR here because I want to align this E-slice and solve these corners. Then I'll do L2, and then misalign again. So that was 5 moves, and now I'm left with 3 edges. So in total, it took me 24 moves to get here, canceling 1 because of NIS, so 23 to get to this point, and I just have 3 edges in the same slice, and it's in the same slice as my original domino reduction on red-orange, which means this is normally optimal. So now I'll build my skeleton, which I'll put on the screen. So if we go through my skeleton, then we are left with these 3 edges, which I can now sticker. There, it's now been stickered. And we'll go back to the beginning of the scramble, or I guess the end of the scramble, the beginning of the solve, and look for places where we can cancel a bunch of moves. So the first move in my skeleton is L prime, and then right here, I noticed that the next move is F2. F2 is part of an algorithm that can swap these 3 edges. So I inserted the 3E algorithm here, and that looks like this. So that started with like an L prime R kind of thing. Since my first move was an L prime, this cancels with the next L prime, so I'm canceling 1 move at the start. I'm also ending with an F2 on that algorithm, which cancels with the F2 in the skeleton. And not only that, but it goes 1 move further. The L cancels with the L2, saving 1 move. So in total, I canceled 4 moves out of a 6 move algorithm. So solving those 3 edges really only took 2 moves. So I'll just go ahead and go through the rest of my skeleton. And the puzzle is solved. So that insertion was optimal, 6 minus 4. A lot of the time you can actually end up doing like 6 minus 5 or even 6 minus 6, solving the 3E in 0 moves. But 6 minus 4 is still really good. And you'll get that a lot of the time doing HTR and DR because of how the method works. One more thing I want to mention is that after I did 12 move domino reduction on the scramble, the rest of the solve was optimal. I put it into NISI, which is a program designed for FMC, and it said that a 13 move finish was optimal, and that was what I had. So yeah, that is it for this very long video. Thank you guys for watching, and goodbye.